1947, the ships that brought the troops home went back for the first post-war immigrants. More people were needed for defence and for the fullest expansion of the economy, according to the Minister for Immigration, Mr. Colwell. He said that failure of the policy would spell national disaster.
1947, 32,000 migrants arrived in Australia. The Commonwealth government is determined that its migration plan shall succeed. If we are to survive as a nation, it must succeed.
The Australian immigration experience has been a really interesting one for a number of reasons. And the first is that Arthur Caldwell, who was the father of immigration, was an Irishman. And this is of significance because when he began the immigration program, he was also not only an Irishman but a person who believed in a republican Australia. He was Minister for Information and he was Minister for Immigration. As Minister for Information, he went out there knowing he had a racist population and said to them, everyone who will come here will be just like you. They will be mostly British and they will be just like you.
70,000 of those coming are from Britain. The rest will come from Europe and America.
As Minister for Immigration, he went out to Europe immediately, seeking the best that Europe had to offer and saying that what he wanted to produce was a working man's paradise in Australia that did not necessarily look at itself as British and was going to be the basis of a republican Australia. Now, this is a very important beginning because people look back to the immigration policy and dismiss it or accuse it of being assimilationist and trying to mould people in a particular way. But in fact, that appears because those who sold immigration knew they had to sell it that way. And the assimilation policy was mostly aimed at the mainstream population. It wasn't so much aimed at the incoming immigrants as now we tend to suggest. So all the time they were saying they're going to be like us, they said that to the population. They didn't say that to the migrants because they went far afield very quickly and invited all sorts of people to become part of the nation.
You are now an Australian citizen and a British subject. You are now an Australian citizen.
New Australians learning English, the tongues of many nations blending in one language, learning a common tongue for the children and their children's children. Assimilation begins here.
The policy is on your hands. Put the book on Miss Lazaridou's table.
Many people felt that they were not to speak their language, not to present themselves as different, so that they would fit in to what the neighbourhood expected of them, not what the state demanded of them, because even the change of name that people say, you know, they were forced to change their names, it took many years before they were allowed to do that because of the Aliens Act that wanted to make sure it kept a track on people. So even that is kind of been mythologised as a pressure. But the neighbourhoods did put a pressure on them until such point as the colourful, diverse contribution that those people began to make did actually begin to enrich the lives of the people in the neighbourhoods.
Australia accepted diversity at a superficial level, but this diversity was never included in the definition of what it was to be an Australian. And one group of Australians weren't accepted on any level.
If you look at different immigrant groups, you do find that over a period of time they do become accepted, they do become part of the community. And people say that why hasn't that happened with Aborigines? Why are they still the most marginalised and excluded group? Maybe they don't want to assimilate. Well, the reality is we never gave them a chance to assimilate. They were driven from their land, they were forced into mission stations, and even today they're still kept on the edge of society. You have to remember that it wasn't until 1967 that we even recognised that Aborigines were part of our population. Until then, we didn't count them in the census. They didn't have the right to vote. They weren't citizens. They weren't part of the Australian community. So if we wonder why just about 20 years later they're still on the outside, it's because we've kept them that way.
While black Australians continued to be kept on the fringes of society, others were kept out of the country altogether.
Think of the White Australia policy.
Well, I think it's good, and they should really have it and keep out the coloured races.
Oh,
But I think it's very good.
But you'd see it kept in force.
I would think so.
Why?
Oh, well, I have no particular reason. Because the coloured races, when they get into a white country, then they want to intermarry, and I don't think it's fair on the children.
Keep them out. Keep all the niggers out. Japs and everybody else.
Why?
Well, we don't want them.
You consider you're superior to the coloured people?
No, I don't know about that, but I do know this. We had enough trouble to get into the Kanakas in Queensland. We don't want Japs or anybody else
But do you
here.
think we can afford not to have?
Yes, I do.
History?
Of course we can.
But why? Why do you say this? Why so sure?
I think one Australia's better than 10 Japs.
Yes, I know, but we're this apart. This is quite apart from the story.
Chinese either. Oh, yes, I believe that's better than the Japs.
Yeah, there's a distinction. You'd take Chinese, but you wouldn't take Japanese.
Well, if I had to choose one or the other, I'd choose neither.
At Australian universities, there are now more than 12,000 students from Asia. They study here on the understanding that they'll return to Asia after completing their
From
studies.
the mid-60s, people from Asia came to study in Australia, the first cracks in the White Australia policy. The course of history in Southeast Asia and the displacement of people from the region put more pressure on Australia to completely abandon any racial basis for its immigration policy. A new wave of immigrants further increased the diversity of the Australian people.
If you take just the 200 years of Australian European settlement, just that period, and artificially cut it up into 4 segments and see what kind of people were in those 4 segments, you will see that in the first 50 years, most of the people in Australia were Aborigines. In the second 50 years, most of the people were transportees from England, Wales, Scotland, and 25% from Ireland, and that's how they regarded themselves. In the third 50 years, they were native-born of those migrants with an ascendancy of the British through the Anglican Church and a construction of Australia around being British and whatever else they wanted to add onto it. The last 50 years, of which we're a part of now, has seen again great diversity. But if you go to see where the image of Australia is constructed, it's not from the first 50 years or the second, it comes from that group that was dominant in the third 50 years, the British people who wrote our history and painted our pictures and controlled our media, who still today are in very dominant positions and define Australia within their own image as British people in Australia.